The pregnant widow dug, alone beneath a sky that offered nothing but silence. New Mexico Territory. August of 1873. The third year of drought had stripped the land of everything soft, leaving it brittle and ancient, like bones bleached and forgotten. Beneath the relentless sun, the wind crept low across the plains, not in violent gusts, but in tired sighs, lifting dust only high enough to whisper that nothing, not even grief, stayed rooted for long. In the middle of that dry, cracking earth, a woman dug. Her dress clung to her with sweat, her hands blistered and bleeding, her belly round with the burden of 7 months of life. Sarah Bellamy held her pickaxe like a lifeline, like it was the only thing left in the world that hadn't betrayed her. Every swing landed with a dull thud against the sun-baked ground, and every recoil punished her shoulders. But she did not slow. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Her lips were dry and split from thirst. But she didn't stop, not even for mercy. Over and over she struck stone and sand and silence, as if digging through the silence itself might bring her closer to him. Then came hoofbeats, steady, deliberate, breaking the rhythm of her labor. A rider emerged from the shimmering distance, silhouetted against the heat. He was older, face carved by sun and time, reins slack in one hand, a dry smirk playing beneath the brim of a wide, dust-worn hat. Oh well, he chuckled, disbelieving. Lady, this dirt's thirstier than hell itself. Sarah didn't pause long. Her grip stayed tight around the pickaxe, her eyes flicking toward him without welcome. She said nothing. The man laughed again, voice coarse with desert dryness. You'll bury yourself out here before you find water. She sucked in a slow breath, voice rasping with defiance. Then I'll bury myself trying, because it's the only way my child stays on the land his father died for. His smirk faltered. Something unreadable flickered across his face. He shifted in the saddle, but spoke no more. Then turned, riding off in a lazy swirl of dust, leaving her once more in the vastness of heat, grief, and silence. Sarah raised her pick again, fury flaring in her chest. She swung. It struck rock. The pain tore up her arm. The world swayed. Her hand slipped. The tool dropped, clattering against the pit wall, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on raw, bruised knees. The desert blurred, spun, rose like smoke, and for a breathless moment, she could hear nothing but the roar of her pulse in her ears. Then dashed footsteps. Slow, steady, unhurried. A shadow stretched beside her. A metal flask appeared next to her hand, its surface dusty, its lid already loosened. She lifted her head with effort. Tom Cade stood above her, broad-shouldered, streaked with grit and silence, his eyes the shade of scorched clay, his jaw set, hard against the wind. He said nothing. He never did, not since the war, not since he returned from the battlefield alone, while her husband did not. But now, here he stood, silent as dust, offering her the flask, not pity, not comfort, just presence. Sarah's pride wavered, but thirst overcame it. She drank 3 long gulps. The water was warm and metallic, but in that moment, it was richer than gold. When she was done, she handed the canteen back with trembling fingers. I don't need your sympathy, she croaked. Tom said nothing. He glanced down at the shallow pit she'd carved from the earth, then at her bleeding, ruined hands. She raised her chin. I don't need help either. Still without a word, he turned, crossed to her shed, and returned with a second shovel. He stepped into the pit and began to dig. Sarah stared, stunned into stillness. She watched his steady rhythm, the precise drive of his blade into stubborn dirt, as if he had always belonged there. I said I'd do it alone, she muttered, but her voice no longer held heat. Tom didn't stop. After a breath, she picked up her dropped pickaxe and stepped back into the hole. If you're staying, she said without meeting his eyes. I set the pace. He paused, briefly met her gaze. He didn't smile, but something inside him softened. Then he dug, and a moment later, so did she. Tom Cade had become a ghost, long before Sarah ever saw him on her land. He lived alone in the hills east of the Bellamy Ranch, just past a dead creek where even the cactus refused to bloom. Folks whispered that he hadn't spoken a word since the war, and most gave up trying. Some said he was half wild. Others told stories about a woman he'd lost. But Sarah knew the truth, or at least the part that mattered. He had returned from war with James's dog Tags in his saddlebag. The two men had gone off together, boys raised side by side, but only one came home, not with stories, not with glory, just silence, and a wound behind his ribs that never fully healed. He hadn't come to save her. He didn't offer to be her savior. But the next morning, before the sun even rose, he returned. No explanation, no words, just the scrape of a shovel against dry earth and the rhythm of two people, working through something nearly impossible, together. Sarah watched him for days before she let herself trust it. He moved with care, not speed. He didn't rest unless necessary. When her belly cramped, he adjusted the ladder. When her hands blistered, he left a pair of worn gloves on the fence post without speaking. By the third day, she no longer tensed when he passed her tools. By the fifth, she began leaving. A second cup on the porch at sundown. Each night, he drank, nodded once, and walked away. She never asked him to stay. He never offered. Still, he came back. There was something about that kind of presence, no obligation, no praise. Just showing up, one afternoon, after hours of breaking through clay so dense it chipped their blades. Sarah finally leaned on her shovel and looked at him. "Why are you here, Tom?" The sun painted the sky in streaks of blood and fire. His dirt-streaked face barely shifted. "I mean it," she said, sharper now. "You don't owe me anything. I didn't ask for this." He said nothing. She let out a slow breath, dropped her shovel. "If this is about guilt, or pity, or ghosts between you and James." He looked at her, a still, solemn gaze. Then slowly, he crouched, pressed his palm flat against the cracked earth, held it there, still and reverent. Then he tapped the dirt twice with his fingertips. Sarah stared. "He's still here," she whispered. Tom nodded. The air changed. Heavy, full, a grief that didn't sting, didn't scream but stayed quiet and weighty. She bent down, laid her own hand beside where his had been, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she rose, wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, and picked up her shovel. "We dig," she said. Tom followed, still silent, but she didn't need his voice anymore. She understood him. The desert didn't cry for its losses. It didn't wail or beg for rain. It buried its pain beneath dust and stone, beneath silence. It waited, and only those who dared to dig could ever hope to touch what it left behind. So Sarah dug. As the sun climbed, she moved with practiced pain. Her back no longer flinched. Her breath stayed even. But her thoughts weren't on the well. They were with James. She remembered the first time she saw him again after war, dust on his boots, that crooked grin that hadn't changed. He kissed her hand in front of her father and asked if she still liked wildflowers. "Nothing grows out here," she'd replied. And James, ever the dreamer, had said, "Then we'll make it grow." They built a life on stubborn ground with borrowed nails and belief. She saw him now in fragments, chopping wood until steam rose from his breath, dancing in silence while the wind screamed outside, laughing behind the barn after bickering over fence posts. They fought fair. They loved fiercely, even when the well first ran dry, even when food had to be rationed. Then came the fire, a spark from the blacksmith's forge, a gust of wind. Flames devoured the town depot. Sarah had run, breathless, by the time she arrived. The fire was ash and James lay beneath the west wall, arms locked round the man he shielded. Tom Cade. She hadn't seen him since the war. Now he was covered in soot, blood staining his shirt, and his eyes weren't crying. They were drowning, with something worse than grief, something heavier. Tom disappeared after the funeral, vanished into the desert like it had called him. Home. Sarah, heavy with James's child, thought she'd never see him again, until he returned, not with flowers or apologies, but with a shovel, with silence, with hands that remembered the land like a sacred thing. Now, she leaned against her blade and looked at the sky, vast, white, the same cruel stillness it had held the day James died. She scooped a handful of dry earth and let it slip between her fingers. "James," she whispered, "you were the one who believed the water would come." Behind her, the shovel scraped on. Tom was still digging. Her throat tightened. Maybe water would never come. Maybe this well was never about water. Maybe it was about proving that something still lived here. Not rain, not salvation, but courage. She stepped forward, tightened her grip, and dug. A month passed. The hole deepened. The earth stayed dry. They hit red soil, but never wet. Still, Tom came each dawn, left at dusk, swing after swing, calluses and silence. Other settlers gave up. Wagons rolled west, graves left behind. But Sarah stayed because James had believed, because her child needed roots, because Tom Cade, without reason or reward, kept digging. At the trading post, a ranch hand scoffed. Heard Cade's digging up on your land again. He said, loud enough for everyone to hear, don't suppose he's working for free. Huh, another man laughed. If he ain't after the water, maybe he's after the widow. Sarah turned. Her voice was a blade. He hasn't laid a hand on me, but he is the only man who did not run when I eat. He does not stare at my belly like it's a burden. So, unless you plan to dig your own soul up with a shovel, leave his name out of your filthy mouth. Silence. She left with her oil and her pride intact. That night, for the first time, she asked Tom to stay for supper. He hesitated at the door. She didn't wait, just set out a second plate and stirred the beans. He ate, quiet, nodded when she passed him. Bread. And slowly, things changed. When the sun beat down, he lowered the shade. When her back ached, he chopped wood. When pain struck her belly, he knelt beside her, pressed her hand, and breathed with her slow, steady. He never overstayed. But his presence became shelter. Then came the night she woke screaming. James's voice, fire, her child slipping into dust. She jolted upright, chest heaving, the room to still. Then the door creaked. Tom stood barefoot, shirt loose, eyes calm. He didn't ask, didn't touch. He laid a folded blanket at her feet, still warm, from where he'd slept on the porch. Then turned to leave. Tom, she whispered. He paused. Thank you. He nodded once and shut the door. She buried her face in the blanket. Sun, sweat, would smoke and slept. No water in the well, but something else was growing. At dawn, the air felt different. Tom stood by the well, shovel gripped in both hands. When she reached him, he pointed. 5 feet down, the soil had changed, darker, damp. It clung to the blade. She knelt, touched it. Cool, real. She looked up. Is it real? Tom didn't speak, just dug harder, faster. The shovel bit deep. Arcs of dirt flew. She tried to stop him, to say they had time, but he was already lost in motion. Minutes passed. An hour. His shirt soaked, his breath ragged. She brought him water. He waved it off. Then his blade struck something deeper. He slipped, fell to one knee. She ran, just as he clutched his hand. Blood slicked the handle. A fresh gash had opened across his fingers, narrow but deep. The kind that didn't bleed loud but bled long. Tom, Sarah gasped, stumbling to her knees beside him, breath hitching in her throat. Stop, please. He didn't answer, didn't even look at her. Just cradled his hand like it belonged to someone else. She reached for him, gently but with urgency, wrapping his torn flesh in a clean strip of rag she fumbled from her apron. Her fingers trembled as she bound the wound, the cloth blooming red almost instantly. Still, he didn't flinch. Their hands touched, hers, pale and shaking, wrapped over his rough, earth-worn, streaked in dirt and effort. He looked down at the contact, then at her face. She didn't pull away. You can't keep tearing yourself apart, she whispered. Her voice frayed like worn lace, not for something that might never come. His lips parted slightly, like a word had tried to escape, then changed its mind. I'm scared, she continued, her voice cracking like dry timber, not just of losing the land. I'm scared of going through this alone, of screaming into an empty room when it's time, of dying before I even hold my child. Silence. Then slowly, Tom reached into the pocket of his work shirt. From within it, he drew a coin, silver, dulled by time, its edges smooth from years of being handled. She knew it instantly. James's coin, the one he always kept tucked in his boot for luck, for faith, for remembrance. Her breath caught in her chest. You kept it, she whispered. Tom nodded, once, quiet, steady. With both hands, he extended it to her, not forcing, not offering it like a grand gesture, but like something meant to be passed on in silence. She shook her head, tears rising behind her lashes. "This is yours." He didn't move. "No," she breathed, voice trembling. "You don't owe me this. You don't owe me anything." Still, he waited, his palm open. Sarah reached out slowly, took the coin, felt the weight of it in her hand. Cold, honest, familiar. And then, after a long pause, she turned his hand over and pressed it back into his calloused skin. "You already paid," she said softly, barely louder than breath. "With every day you showed up, with every word you never said, with staying when no one else did." His eyes widened not with shock, but with something loosening, something shifting behind the wall of his silence. She folded his fingers gently over the coin. His hand closed not out of reflex, but with quiet purpose, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker pass through his gaze, not grief, not the old weight of sorrow, but something that shimmered faintly like peace. The well had not yet offered water, but something deeper, something more hidden, had broken open. It began with wind, a low, ominous growl crawling down from the northern hills. Within hours, that growl became a roar, sweeping over the plains with such force it bent fence posts and turned the sky the color of scorched rust. By mid-morning, the sun was gone. In its place hung a dull, burning light that made everything appear bruised, surreal. Tom felt it before he saw it. His horses paced the corral nervously, ears pinned, nostrils flaring. The wind pulled at the barn roof, whizzing through every crack and seam. He dropped the feed sack, eyes narrowing, and turned instinctively toward the house. Inside, Sarah gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her breathing uneven, her back arched with pain. Tom burst through the door just as she crumpled to her knees. She didn't scream, couldn't. "Tom," she gasped, face pale and drawn. "It's early. It's not time." He caught her before she fell, one arm locking around her shoulders, the other bracing her against the wood floor as the first true contraction carved its way through her. Outside, the storm struck with fury. Wind slammed against the walls, dust spilled through the shutters in thick, choking plumes. The air turned gritty, unbreathable, as if the land itself was shedding its skin. Tom moved fast. He grabbed blankets from the bed, set water to boil, cleared the space near the hearth where the stone walls offered the most protection. He propped her against pillows, knelt at her side, and clasped her trembling hands, her fingers dug into his palm, her jaw locked with pain. He shook his head steady. "Sure, breathe," he whispered, though it barely registered as sound. He inhaled, deep and slow, drawing her into his rhythm, sensing her body with his breath. One hand cupped her neck, the other anchored her palm to his. Lightning flared behind boarded windows. Thunder cracked like cannon fire across the valley. Still, Tom did not move. Her cries came raw, jagged, pulled from some primal place where words could not live. The pain surged in waves, merciless and fast. Blood, heat, panic. Too much, too soon. But he stayed. He wiped her brow, pressed his body close when she shook with fear, whispered nothing, but his eyes never left hers. The house shuddered. The wind howled like it wanted in. Dust coated the floor, the hearth, their fingers, and then, at last, came a cry, not hers, a small, fierce sound, like life itself torn from the mouth of the storm. She gasped, fell back, her arms limp. Tom held the child, tiny, red, slick with blood and clay, but breathing, crying, alive. He wrapped the boy in the cleanest cloth he could find, then placed him carefully into Sarah's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, at the strength in such small lungs, and then up, right at Tom, she said, her voice shaking. His eyes met hers, red-rimmed. "Damp, you," she whispered. "The first face he saw was yours." She reached for his wrist, guided his hand to the baby's chest, pressed his palm gently against the tiny heartbeat. We are family now." Something in his expression shattered quietly, not with noise, but with release. Something broke, opened behind his silence, and though no words came, the answer sat heavy in his eyes, deeper than speech, older than fear. He lowered his head, forehead brushing hers, and together they sat amid the wreckage of storm and pain, with dust still, swirling, and a child's cry echoing like a hymn, 3 hearts beating in rhythm. Outside, the wind raged on, But within that small house, something had settled, something sacred. After the storm, the land seemed quieter, as if it had exhaled. But the digging didn't stop. Tom returned to the well. Before the first rooster crowed, before the wind stirred. His hands were wrapped now, his back slower to straighten, but his rhythm remained the same. He said nothing to Sarah, only nodded when she brought water. She did not ask him to rest. She understood better than most that men like Tom did not stop moving, not after what they'd lived through, what they'd built, what they had pulled from the dust together. Then, one morning, it happened. Sarah was feeding the baby near the window when she heard it, a sharp hiss, a muffled gasp, a breath drawn like it hadn't been taken in years. She bolted. Baby clutched to her chest, her feet pounding the packed earth. Tom was still in the pit, coated in mud, but kneeling hands sunk into the soil around a stream of water that surged from the earth like it had been waiting a lifetime to be found. It bubbled, clear and cold, as if the desert had finally, mercifully, opened its veins. His face was smeared with grit, soaked to the bone, but his eyes, they burned. Tom. She reached the edge of the well, chest heaving. The baby stirred in her arms, let out a soft sound, then fell still, as if even he understood something had shifted. The water rushed into the basin Tom had carved weeks before. He guided it with his hands, dammed it with stones, watched it take shape like a man witnessing a miracle. Neighbors came from the hills, then more. Within a day, word had spread the widow's land had found water. Those who had mocked, those who had left, some began to return. But Sarah only saw him. Tom climbed from the well, boots slick, shirt clinging to his chest. He stood taller now, his gaze fixed on her like he didn't believe this was real. She walked to him slowly, the baby asleep against her shoulder. She placed her hand over his heart, felt it beat steady, strong. "You don't have to speak," she murmured. "I heard you, the day you picked up that shovel." His throat moved, but no sound came. She smiled. "You showed up, you stayed. You carried everything James couldn't. That says more than any words." Tom looked down at the baby, then back to her. His lips parted, not to speak, but to draw a breath, deep, whole, the kind of breath that only comes after a silence has ended. And that was enough. The earth had given, and so had they. 1 year later, the wells still flowed. The water ran clear and true, steady as a promise kept beneath the weight of drought and time. It fed the land that had once turned to powder beneath the wind. It softened the edges of despair and coaxed green from the earth, modest at first, but insistent. Little by little, life crept back. Patches of grass curled through the dust like forgiveness. Stubborn shoots of barley reached skyward, unsure but unbroken. Behind the barn, a pear tree had taken root, just a sapling, but alive. Tom had planted it in silence and tended it every morning with the reverence of a man who believed it carried something sacred. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. Sarah moved through it with the rhythm of someone returned to herself. Her voice was softer now but full, her hands still firm, but no longer clenched from fear. Ashcade Bellamy toddled barefoot across the porch with fists full of feathers and pebbles. Wide-eyed and steady, he had his mother's quiet strength and something in his gaze that belonged only to Tom, the man who had never spoken, but who had never once walked away. Tom built a new fence around the well, simple, sturdy cedar posts, hand-smoothed and sun-bleached. Above it, he mounted a wooden sign, carved slowly across long nights when the words still refused to pass his lips. Asterisk, each stroke cut with patience, with intention. The sign read, "The place that held the last soul I couldn't lose." Sarah found it one morning while walking the baby. She paused at the post, traced each letter with her fingers, and felt a weight lift from her chest, one she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The town stopped asking questions. They no longer needed answers. They saw the three of them, Tom, Sarah, and Ash, each Sunday at market. They saw the way Tom carried the boy on his shoulders, how the child reached into his hair and laughed without fear. They saw Sarah hand him tools without needing to speak, how he always reached back to touch her hand, a silent thank you passed between skin. No one mentioned papers. No one asked about dresses or rings, but the names changed anyway. People began calling her Mrs. Cade, and not once, not ever, did she correct them. One evening, As twilight bled into gold and the sharp edges of the mesa softened into smoke, Tom stood beside the well, watering the pear tree. Ash darted between his legs in looping circles, a carved wooden horse tucked tight in his grip. Sarah sat on the porch, mending a shirt, her eyes drifting between needle and horizon. "Think it'll fruit this year?" she called out. Tom shrugged, then nodded. She smiled. That was answer enough. Ash tripped, fell into the dust, but before his mouth could open in complaint, Tom bent, scooped him up with one arm, dusted his pants with the other, and handed him a small stone to hold. Ash beamed, pain forgotten, joy returned. Sarah watched them, the sun behind them stretching their shadows long across the land, and something inside her ached, not from sorrow, but from the sheer, aching fullness of what they'd built. A home, not the one she started with, not the one she thought she'd have, but one that had risen slowly, deliberately, from silence and sweat and the kind of love that never asked to be spoken aloud. Inside, above the hearth, hung a framed collection of relics. James's silver coin, now burnished nearly to copper, a folded piece of cloth, one of the first blankets Tom had wrapped around Ash, and pressed between them a wildflower, the first one to grow beside the well. Sarah had pressed it in secret. She'd never told Tom. She hadn't needed to. Some things are meant to be held quietly. As the sun slipped below the hills, Tom looked back at the house. Sarah raised her eyes. Their gazes met. She nodded once. He nodded back. Asterisk, and the world kept moving. Wind in the trees, cattle lowing in the distance, laughter bubbling from the mouth of a child who didn't yet know what it had cost to bring him into this world whole. But someday he would stand at the edge of the well, read the words carved into that sign, and understand that his life had been born not only of blood, but of choice, of presence, of staying, of hands that never let go. There are men who shout, and there are men who remain. Some carve their names into stone, others into silence. But the ones who stay when the world breaks wide open, they are the ones who last. Like water beneath the dust, like roots hidden deep in the desert. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that love doesn't always come with promises or grand gestures, but with hands that endure and hearts that stay, then you've come to the right place. Here on Wild West Love Stories, we share tales not only of romance, but of resilience, of quiet devotion, of choices made in dust and heat, where love is carved not in words, but in labor, in silence, and in memory. Subscribe to the channel and ride with us each week through the wind, the danger, and the beauty of the American frontier, where even the softest love can echo forever.